Today on episode number 635 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, Servingness and Liberatory Teaching with Gina and Garcia.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. Dr. Gina Ann Garcia is a professor in the Berkeley School of Education, where she teaches as the inaugural faculty director of Latinx Thriving Initiatives and directs the Heart Lab. She coined the term Servingness, a framework for how Hispanic serving institutions move from simply enrolling Latin students to genuinely serving them. And she's written 3 books on the subject, most recently, The HSI Movement, Strategies Driving Change at Hispanic Serving Institutions. She also hosts the podcast, Que Pasa HSIs. In this conversation, Gina defines what servingness asks of all of us who teach, makes the case that academic outcomes matter, but liberatory ones matter too, and gets specific about what it looks like to bring our whole selves into the classroom and invite our students to do the same. Gina Garcia, welcome to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you today.
It is a pleasure to get to talk to you. We've had conversations. They've just been one way in the past after getting to hear you speak at a number of conferences. I'm not positive about this, but I think you might be the only person I've had on who has coined a term. I could be wrong, so forgive me, past guests, if I'm wrong, but tell us about this term that you coined and what it has meant to you, but also to our communities.
Servingness is the term I assume you're talking about. Yes.
Unless you've done more than one, then we really got to talk.
No, I was thinking that. I was like, how many terms have I coined? But yeah, I always say servingness wasn't a word before me and my colleagues actually wrote about it and coined it. And nobody's questioned it ever since, right? People are like, servingness, like we embrace it. So the term servingness comes from the Hispanic Serving Institutions movement. From the research, those of us that have been doing research with Hispanic serving institutions have spent most of our time thinking about the S, right? Hispanic serving institutions, and to say, what does the S mean? And when my colleagues, Amory Nunez and Vanessa Sanson, wrote this article that we were creating the multidimensional conceptual framework for understanding servingness, I don't think we realized the impact the word was going to have. I don't even, it was so uneventful. I don't even remember us really being like, ooh, let's call it servingness, right? Like it just was like, it's servingness. Like we're going to call it servingness, and that's what it is. And so servingness has really meant a lot to the Hispanic Serving Institution community, the community that had questioned, are we Hispanic enrolling or are we Hispanic serving? Because most people argue that Hispanic serving institutions are only Hispanic enrolling or Latino enrolling because they enroll a critical mass of Latina students, but don't change what they're doing. And so myself and many have now written about this idea of servingness to say, you have to do something different. You have to adapt to your students. Your students are different. They're unique. They are not what they were 50 years ago. They are completely new types of students, and we have to adapt. And with the servingness framework in particular, I talk a lot about it being an organizational change framework and saying this framework allows you to think about change. How do you change your policies? How do you change your decision-making? How do you change your teaching? How do you change who is teaching, right? Like who shows up to the classroom matters too. When majority of the students in the classroom are now students of color with minoritized backgrounds, who's teaching them matters as well, like even their own demographics of the professor. So thinking holistically of all the ways we could potentially serve our students is what servingness is.
There is another area of pushback that you have for us today, and that has to do with academic outcomes. You tell us that academic outcomes are vital, but they are not enough. In what ways are academic outcomes insufficient for us serving our students well?
Yes, for sure. Yes, that's another one of my areas I get on soapbox a lot. So servingness a lot and this idea that I have called liberatory outcomes. I don't think I coined that necessarily, but people do often say, like Dr. Garcia says, because people call it, I mean, they've been called non-cognitive outcomes for years, right? For a long time. And non-academic in the servingness framework, we actually call them non-academic. And I hated that term because I'm like, they're not actually non-academic because this idea, at least the way I think about it, is that students get a lot out of their classroom experience, not just a GPA and a grade, right? Like the grade that then contributes to their GPA, that then contributes to their graduation, all that's important, but they get so much more. So I didn't love the term non-academic or non-cognitive either because they happen in the classroom a lot. These outcomes I'm talking about. I have a degree in college student personnel, student affairs. I have training in student affairs. So in student affairs, we learn a lot about how students grow and develop outside of the classroom. And so I believe in that as well. I think students do absolutely grow in their student organizations, in the programs that we offer on campus, in the multicultural spaces on campus, right? The EOPs, all that. Yes, they grow and they benefit from those as well. But it happens in the classroom also, right? So the idea of liberatory outcomes is this way of thinking about if we're thinking about liberatory education, which comes from like a Paulo Freirean bell hooks type of approach to liberation, right? That liberation can happen in the classroom and particularly for minoritized people. Like when Paulo Freire wrote about it, it was about the poor, right? People who are poor. How do poor people in that way, people who are oppressed economically, become liberated in a classroom and sort of help to learn how to liberate themselves, right? Free themselves from oppression rather than waiting for someone to come save them, right? Like there's no saving happening. How do we empower minoritized students to uplift and advance and fight for justice, right? For themselves and their own communities. So I think a lot about that type of liberation. And so this idea of liberatory outcomes is like, if we are providing a liberatory experience in the classroom, well, how are we going to measure it? Yes, their grades, the data, the research says that their grades should be higher when we provide that kind of experience. But what else do they get? And so I talk a lot about like the critical consciousness that we know that comes out of, let's say, ethnic studies courses, right? There's a lot of research about that students become more critically conscious in a classroom where they get to explore socio-cultural, political history of themselves or other communities, and they become action oriented. They want to do something about it. How do we do that in a math classroom? Can we do it in a math classroom? Absolutely. Math is numbers. We could show data all day long that show inequities that will enhance students' consciousness, right? Around, wow, I didn't realize there were these inequities, depending on what would be the context of that. So critical consciousness, identity development, them seeing themselves within the classroom space. Does that matter? And should we be measuring that, right? Like, and how can we measure that? So I have a project that we're doing that here at UC Berkeley in my Latinos in Ed class, and we are using validated scales and looking at students when they come in, what is their critical consciousness score and their racial ethnic identity score, and then 15 weeks later, does it change? As you can imagine, it doesn't. What we're seeing is it doesn't change dramatically because it's only 15 weeks, but there are some changes. There is definitely, we've seen some movement and then qualitatively collecting some data to ask students what those experiences were that help to explain even the slightest change in those scales. So yes, thinking a lot about what that looks like to think about outcomes beyond just their final grade.
I'm glad that you brought up Freire and Hooks, and would appreciate you talking a bit more about what they tell us, that liberation can't be given to other people, only practiced together. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, this idea of like saviorism that's not liberation, right? That's not liberatory outcomes. Like Paulo Freire talks about like the oppressed working side by side with the oppressor, right? Like literally it should be that, like that kind of work, right? That all the groups should be coming together, even the dominant groups, the social historical dominant groups in the area wherever you're teaching from should be doing this work as well, right? That they're part of the solution as well. But that the goal with the classroom where liberation is happening, or liberation pedagogy is happening, is to first expose students to the oppression or the inequities and help them to see it themselves, right? And for people who are oppressed, you don't necessarily know, right? Like you actually don't know you're oppressed. You're living fine, right? Like life is fine until it becomes something that you actually know, like, wow, I didn't ever realize, right? I mean, there's lots of studies about, like, let's say liberation. I talk about math, like liberation pedagogy in a math course, and exposing students to what is the corner stores, the number of corner stores in a low income community versus those in a higher income suburb area, right? And that exposure alone, students in those lower income communities will become aware of something that they weren't aware of. How are they going to know what's in the higher income suburbs? They've never been there, or that I've never even crossed the railroad tracks, right? There's research about that, right? Like teaching students about, like, let's say crossing railroad tracks. They've never gotten on the train, they've never crossed the river, right? Like we stay within our spaces, right? We don't necessarily venture out far. So you don't necessarily know you're oppressed. And so this like liberatory education approach is exposing students to that knowledge and then helping them to build the tools on like what that means to fight back and resist against that oppression. But yeah, it should be all of us working side by side simultaneously.
I know you've been doing a lot around storytelling lately. Would you tell us a story about what a liberatory experience might look like? Take us
In
there.
the classroom.
Take us to that classroom.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can talk about my classroom. My
Yay.
classroom, like I said, so I'm at UC Berkeley. We are not a Hispanic serving institution yet. We're close. We're about 22%. And the 25% is the cutoff for the point where in which you become an HSI. So we have a pretty large growing Latino population, obviously, with that percentage, with the large campus like ours. But our faculty do not match the students, as in many HSIs, they don't. And so it's personal to me, right? Like I'm a Latina identified professor at UC Berkeley who I want to show up whole as my whole self, my whole unapologetic self to the classroom. And so I teach this class. I get the honor of teaching a class called Latinos in Education. And yeah, I show up in all the ways and it matters. The students, they talk about just my presence, right? That like I show up and I am who I am. I show up in my hoop earrings. I show up in my heels. Those of you that have ever seen me speak publicly know I'm big on my like big old heels. I show up with red lipstick on, right? Like things that to them represent like Latina, right? Like they're like, she does all those things, right? She just showing up as my unapologetic self matters and feels liberating to them, right? But we also do things like, I teach a class from 5 to 8 p.m. Once a month, I buy food for the whole class, 65 students, and it's Latino food, right? I want it to feel like home to them. I want them to feel that sense of home. And they talk about that, right? That's feels different, right? To have a professor who's not only buying them food, but also food that hits home, right? In a different sort of way. Like it makes them feel like they belong there, right? Like they can see themselves in that classroom space. So that's just before even talking about anything I teach about, right? Like just the actual feeling. I talk about servingness as a feeling. Like the way you make a classroom space feel matters, right? What that they feel. Students talk about feeling like they could speak Spanish in the classroom is empowering for them, right? When they're in a classroom with the majority Latino identified and not everybody speaks Spanish, but a lot do, and they start to feel comfortable, even with me randomly saying words in Spanish here and there, because of course it's delivered in English, but just integrating it here and there, they feel empowered, right? Like, oh, we can speak Spanish, right? And so they get to, even to each other, right? That now they can speak Spanish to each other. And that feels empowering and that feels liberating in a place like UC Berkeley, where they think they're supposed to leave their whole culture outside of the gates, right? Like don't walk onto campus with your culture, don't walk on with your language, all that stays outside. And suddenly they're in a classroom space where it's like, absolutely, you can bring all those things in and the professor brings it in too, right? So those kind of things, I think just feel different to students and matters to students a lot. And it feels small, but it's huge, has huge impact.
I would love to invite you to give listeners a Spanish lesson. Teach us in Spanish how to say the process is beautiful and why that is so important for so many of us that love our checklists.
El proceso es bonito. The process is beautiful. And I think one of the things about process is that it's not linear and it's not perfect, right? Like, and that's fine, right? Like, it doesn't have to be linear and perfect and hit all the checklist. It can be ugly and messy. Gloria Anzaldúa teaches us that messiness is actually okay, right? Things can be messy. It doesn't have to fit perfectly in one sort of way. So, yeah, I think that's what I would say about that.
Another thing that you tell us is that we own the work. We own the work. You talked about this a bit earlier in terms of how our STEM disciplines might think about teaching their classes. I wonder if there's anything else you want to offer in terms of culturally relevant pedagogy across some different disciplines that you're seeing that's kind of sparked some things in you where you go, wow, that they're really doing something interesting there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of great work going on, honestly. I get to visit a lot of campuses. I do a lot of keynote talks and workshops and professional development with a lot of campuses, even just here across California, and particularly in our California community colleges, I think are doing some phenomenal work. I think if we're going to learn from anybody, we should learn from community colleges because they just really think about it. And our community colleges in particular right now here in California have been thinking a lot about like college level math and English, because I don't know how many people listeners are aware, but we basically eliminated developmental mathematics and English in the California community colleges system. Students can opt immediately into college level, and a majority do. Most of them opt into it immediately. They don't want to go into remedial. That's what the policy has taught us. So faculty had to adapt a lot, right, to figure that out. So there's two ways you can go about that. Complain that like we need developmental ed, or you can adapt. And it's been nice to see people adapting, right, and figuring out, okay, how do you build in sort of support systems within the classroom? I think we always think that class support has to be outside the classroom, that like, okay, you have to go to tutoring or you have to go to supplemental instruction, right? Like those are outside. Supplemental instruction, I guess, is unique because it's sort of in class and out of class. But how do you, and I think that would probably be the way to think about it, right? How do you build those supports into the classroom space? So I think when I think about culturally relevant practices within, let's say, STEM spaces, you don't necessarily have to bring the Latino food or be the Latina professor with the hoop earrings, but that thinking about people's ways of learning, right? It's not just those cultural pieces, but ways of learning are also cultural as well, right? That to be in community is a way of learning. It's a very cultural way of learning, right? That a lot of the small group work is much more impactful than, let's say, the large lecture, right? And this is stuff we've been saying a long time. And it's not always easy to do that. Like talking about this at a place where we do have 300 people lecture halls, right? It's hard to break that up. But I think if you're in a place where you can do a lot more of the small breakout active learning, like that just hits your students of color, your Latino communities differently, right? Learning in community, I think, is going to be different. So I think there's a lot of ways to think about cultural relevance rather than just the sort of specific cultural pieces.
Earlier, you mentioned how Servingness is a change management framework. And as we think about changing within ourselves, you tell us how crucial self-awareness is. Why is that such a vital part of any change effort?
Yes. I do talk about that. Everything I talk about is grounded in research, right? Like I read a lot and think a lot about what I can learn from the research. And that's pretty foundational sort of research, particularly in thinking about how we better serve minoritized populations, that you have to start actually with yourself, that you have to understand who are you and how do you show up. And in doing that, then you start to think, well, then who are the students I'm showing up to and for? And people always most commonly want to look for the connection, right? Which makes sense, right? Of course, we want to know, well, okay, maybe I'm not exactly what these students are, but I have something in common, right? We can always find something in common with them. But doing that sort of analysis of yourself and acknowledging your privileges, right? Like I acknowledge my privileges all the time, even though I have minoritized identities, I have a ton of privileges, so many privileges. Even just being the professor and walking into the space with a PhD is a huge privilege to have been able to been educated in that way and to be at this moment, right? So doing that analysis of sort of my privileges and where do I meet students and where am I don't connect with them as much because I have those privileges, right? But still acknowledging them, right? And realizing, well, what do those privileges bring us? They bring us networks. Let's say a PhD brings you networks, right? Okay, I have networks. Okay, great. I can bring those networks into the classroom And I do, right? I'm like, all right, who can I bring that can talk about this particular topic? Because I have people across the country that I can bring in to talk about this topic because I'm well networked, right? That's a privilege. So how do I access and utilize that privilege and bring it to my students? So yeah, the self-assessment and acknowledging all the different ways that we show up, both privileged and minoritized, I think it matters a lot for the way we changed our approach to teaching in particular.
You talk about a enrollment era giving
Hmm.
way to a transitional era, and I invite you to share about freedom dreaming and
Hmm.
why that's important to you and to anyone who is willing to participate, even if we don't necessarily ever get to see the fruits of those efforts.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Bonnie, touching my heart now. You're talking about the books, the HSI books, the trilogy, I'll call them. Third book is about to be released in September, the HSI movement. In the HSI movement, I talk about how the HSI construct has evolved over time. As being somebody who's watched and observed for the last like 15 years, I've been writing about Hispanic servant institutions and had the privilege and honor to watch the progression. And so I talk about the enrollment era being when we were just in this Hispanic enrolling era. That's all faculty or that's all campuses were concerned about. Like, did we hit 25% HSI or not? And if we didn't and we were at 24%, well, then we're not an HSI yet. And that's just not the reality, right? The reality is that's an arbitrary number. The enrollment designation could have been anything. The enrollment cutoff could have been anything. So as we moved into this transition era, people stopped worrying as much about that 25% cutoff and started moving into the change work that I'm talking about, the servingness, right? Using the servingness framework to drive change. So in the HSI movement in the book, there are people, it's an empirical study. So there are participants who are not at HSIs, they're at emerging HSIs. And at one point in the book, I say, we can learn the most from emerging HSIs because people are trying really hard to do something different. They're trying actively to think about all the ways that we can better serve our students, whether it be in the classroom or out of the classroom or in our mission statement or in our strategic plan, that all of those can be much more intentional and adapting more to the student needs. So yeah, so moving into the transitional era. As far as the freedom dreaming, that really, I talked a lot about that for in transforming HSIs, which was the previous book. And that comes from Robin G. Kelly's thinking, right? Everybody sort of cites him for that thinking around freedom dreaming. And I just borrow it from him, but people love it. This idea that we can imagine in the abolitionist world. I've been reading a lot about abolitionists. In the abolitionist thinking, scholarship is really about abolishing prisons, right? Like it comes from that. We've borrowed it and brought it into education. Of course, we in education we borrow all the things and bring them in because we're interdisciplinary. But it really is about abolishing the carceral system. And in the abolitionist work, there's very much this piece about dreaming about something different. That abolition isn't about getting completely dismantling something and just destroying it. It's actually about envisioning something different, a different kind of world. And so that's the freedom dreaming, right? To dream about something different, to envision something new and different that better serves us is that freedom dreaming. And so for me, I talk about it with Hispanic serving institutions, with colleges and universities, freedom dreaming and the people within them dreaming about institutions that actually serve all of us, even the people, even the professors and the staff, everybody in them. And that's a freedom dream. We're not there yet. We have not yet reached that point, right? It's a utopian vision, as I call it in transforming HSIs. But that if we don't dream about it, we're never actually going to reach it. And that's that abolitionist thinking of envisioning something new, envisioning new worlds.
When you talk about this change model, and then now you're sharing with us how important it is for us to be able to dream and the process you're drawing from the freedom dreaming, what conditions are necessary in order for human beings to get together and dream?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah. It's kind of a privilege, huh? To be able to get to dream about something. And it is, and I think that that's something that abolitionists would agree, right? That not everybody has the privilege to just sit around and dream about something new, right? Like we just don't have that time and that space. So I think there are those conditions, right? That we need to think about that it is a privileged space to be able to dream because you're able to hold space with like, what do I currently do and what am I dreaming about this vision, right? A lot of dreamers, freedom dreamers, are organizers, right? People who are on the ground organizing and envisioning something different than what is happening now. Those of us like me who are freedom dreaming within a university space, as I mentioned, it's a privilege to be a professor. I get to write, right? I get to write my freedom dreams down and share with others, right? I get to come on a podcast, an academic podcast, and talk about freedom dreaming. I get to write about it in blogs. I publish blogs all the time on my website. I get to post it on social media. This vision. So I think there is that, right? That it is a privileged space. First of all, those of us that are dreaming about a new future, we have the freedom to do it, right? People who are incarcerated, people who are currently in detention camps, which we know are growing, the number of people that are in immigration detention camps, don't have the privilege of getting to dream about something new. There's a real reality of like, I need to get out of this situation right now, right? Like, forget what I'm dreaming about in the future. I actually need to get out of this situation. So I think that's something to acknowledge, right? As far as like those of us that we have freedom are the ones that get to envision freedom, but also that's our responsibility. Because I think there's people that question why I am so passionate about freedom for all communities, even if they're not my own. And I'm like, because it's the right thing to do, right? Like, and I have the privilege to be able to write about and advocate and dream about freedom for all communities, because I can see that it's wrong that certain communities don't have the freedom or the due process that was given to them just by being here, right, on US soil. People have lost that. So yeah, so I think that's a really good question to grapple with, right? As far as who even gets to freedom dream.
You were talking earlier about this instrument that you use around critical cultural awareness. I don't think I have the name right. I'm curious, do you get to see the change from awareness of that to dreaming? Can someone get to dreaming by the end of a class, or does it take longer than that? What's been your experience for getting to see that ever?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm using a critical consciousness scale, right?
There we
Critical
go.
consciousness is like Paulo Freire foundational stuff, right? Like that's what he advocates for. There are several. If anybody's listening and you want the scale, because a lot of people want it, reach out. I will drop you a few. Our ed psych scholars, colleagues have created several and validated several scales to look at critical consciousness. And a lot of times they're doing it with youth, right? So youth critical consciousness, like youth being like 8 to 15 years old, right? Like that kids are becoming critically conscious, right? And wanting to change the world. So that scale that I used actually in my class, right? I ran this pilot study in the fall. We didn't see, and I say we, me and my graduate student who helped me analyze the data, we didn't see huge jumps, but we saw little changes. But the one that was most fascinating to us was that there's a piece called critical action, right? One of the scales is critical action. And so that's what critical consciousness, the way different scholars have broken it down, there's always this action piece that like you become aware, but then you actually have to move into action at some point. You can't just stay your head in the book, right? Like there's that. You can freedom dream about this new world, but at some point you're going to have to actually do something different to move into that, right? Like make that freedom dream reality. And so the action piece actually was lower for students coming in, and it barely moved. And when we really looked at the different dimensions, because there was different questions that people answered that made up that scale, we looked at it and I'm like, well, I didn't do any of these things, right? Like one of them is like, did you write your senator or your local elected official a letter, right? And I'm like, well, let's say had I done that in the class, that would have went up, right? Like there's that. We can manipulate these outcomes really easily, right? If we want to, right? I wasn't trying to manipulate it, but there's some of that is like, well, are we doing the things in the classroom that would actually lead to a change in some of these things? Right. And so now I'm like, ooh, that could be an assignment. we could write a letter, right? Because this particular scale is measuring it in that way. So there's that is also looking at, well, how are these things being measured? Right. I even talked about like a math class could do this. Math class, they could write a letter as an assignment to their elected official, right? They could write a letter to all kinds of people about math concepts, right? And so we could do that if we know what the scale is measuring. So there's that is like, are we doing the things that these measures are even capturing? But I think as far as my time as an educator, I've seen the most dramatic change over more time than a semester, I would say, right? Because there are students I spend a lot more time with, like my graduate students who are with me 4, 5, 6 years, and I tend to see their character arc development much more dramatically, right? Like because I can watch it over a longer period of time. So I think some of these things take time. But the other thing I will say is with the scales, what we noticed was that people came in pretty high already. So by the time they get to me in their third or fourth year, a lot of them are like juniors and seniors in my class. Not only have they already had their whole educational experience K through 12, but now they've already been at UC Berkeley, where they may have taken other classes and become conscious in other ways for a couple years before they even get to me. So they already came in, the foundational numbers were actually pretty high already. So there wasn't a lot of movement to be made. So there's a lot to think about with these things. So, but I encourage people to measure it in their class, because these are then the conversations you start to have, like, ooh, okay, what am I doing? Am I addressing these things? And who else is addressing these things on the campus? Where else would they have gotten some of this growth and development?
I am so appreciating all the things that you just brought up in those examples. You used the word arbitrary early, and of course, class lengths are arbitrary. And I also am cracking up at myself because a spectacular failure that I had some 5 or more years ago was trying to get students to write a letter to a business that they either they wanted to celebrate their corporate social responsibility efforts in some way. So it could have been a positive letter, or it could have been a critical letter saying, whether it's pollution or any number of issues. And you would have thought that I was asking the world of them. I experienced so much resistance from that. So if anyone listening, just a spectacular failure. But while you were talking, I was also reflecting on it really can be challenging to try to fit something into whether it's a term or a semester length. And that's why I really admire the people doing open educational practices, because then you can see letters that were from prior terms or semesters, and then it kind of opens it up. And then maybe somebody comes back and says, hey, you said this 2 months ago, and you know what? I decided to write that letter, even though I'm not in your class anymore. And then it just helps open us up to recognize when we come together in solidarity, we don't always get to have clean data. It is still messy, but you can see a little bit more of glimpses, I guess, instead of when I just try to contain it all. So anyway, that's such a delightful practice. I want to ask you one more question before we get to the actually, I want to ask you 70 questions, but I don't think you have that kind of time today. I want to, and that is just as you were sharing, and we think about our responsibility. It can be challenging for so many of us to say, yes, I want to do it, but I want to do all of the it's. What advice do you have for us in really discerning what is ours to do and what could possibly become more performative or hinder us from being able to do that work that is most fundamental for us to do?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, I think the reality is, at least from my experience, I tend to do the best work in things that I'm most passionate about. Right? Like you can't force some of this. And I think that's why conversations around like culturally relevant pedagogies, anti-racist pedagogies, like things like that are hard, right? They're hard to like force onto people, right? And we did try after 2020 racial awakening for all of us, right? We had that racial reckoning moment. Like we tried to move towards forcing people, right? And I think that was a dramatic pushback. That's why where we are now, this like anti-DEI pushback, because we were almost forcing it. And I think that we can't force things onto people, right? I think we can continue to educate and make folks aware, but the things that we're going to be the best at are the things we're most passionate about, right? And so trying to figure out what's that balance between what needs to happen and what am I most passionate about, right? And how do I collide? How do those two things collide, right? Like, because they should be able to come together in some sort of way. And I'll give an example. I meet so many people out in colleges and universities, and this one biology professor was talking about this biology project where they had the students bring in a plant. It was like a plant class, I guess, a plant from like their culture, right? Like that was something that meant something to them, right, in their culture. And they told me this whole story, how it was just this beautiful, ended up being this whole beautiful project, and that it was this culturally they were telling me like this was culturally relevant, right? And I was like, absolutely, right? Like, yes, right? It completely was, right? But this person was passionate about plants and so made it about plants, right? So I would have never given an example about a plant assignment, giving, let's say, a lecture or a workshop on culturally relevant practices. But that's what made sense to this biologist, right? That like, which makes sense, why that would make sense to the biologist, right? So I'm like, yes, I love that assignment. And I love that it went well for you. And so I think that's a good example of like what are you most passionate about and thinking about how do you bring that, right? How do you show up to do the thing that needs to happen? But by doing something that you find your calling in, right? And you find as your passion.
That's such a good example too, because then that doesn't accidentally then create discomfort because you're inviting students to bring themselves in to the extent that they wish to. And that yeah, what a great example. I'm trying to think about what plants my family members may choose for that one. That's awesome.
Well, it's kind of like your letter example of like some students are gonna be like, I don't have no plan for my family. They're gonna be mad.
Yep. Yep.
So
oh, that's so
you're
funny.
always gonna have that. There's gonna be some epic fails, and then sometimes it's not gonna be epic fail. And like this person, they were like, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever done. And I was like, that's awesome. I love that.
All right, this is the time in the show where we each get to share our recommendations. And I suspect that many listeners are already familiar with the person/video series I'm about to share and maybe already card-carrying members. So there is a woman who founded the We Do Not Care Club, and you may have seen the creator. Gina is vigorously nodding her head, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, you name your choice. And I have been and in case you aren't familiar with her, she is generally wearing some sort of a headpiece and she's got a highlighter or a pencil. She often has two pairs of glasses, the pair that's on her eyes, but then the pair that's up on her head. Presumably she's forgotten, if she's like me, that the second pair is there. And in the particular example I have of her photo, she's got a travel pillow also around her neck in case she wants to take a little nap. And she will just read off lists of things that we do not care about any longer. And again, if you've seen the bit, it is so funny. And she really created this movement, and people would write into her from all over the world with things they do not care about anymore. And the creativity and just the ways in which we can connect with people we've never met before about things that we also do not care anymore has been so fun. Well, she celebrated her 1-year anniversary. And I saw a whole different side of this woman. If you've been following her and you haven't seen this yet, I can't recommend watching it enough, but get out the tissues because she is clearly so moved with how her life has just been transformed. And I don't want to ruin it because I can't certainly speak her words as well as she can. But I just want to say, I guess this is a genre that I love. The We Do Not Care Club is not that she actually doesn't care, and it's not that I don't care, and it's not that Gina doesn't care. We actually do care. And because we care, we then have to free ourselves and each other from the things that we do not care. And it kind of reminds me of Gina's recommendation or her advice to us just a few moments ago, so that we decide what we don't care about so that we can care that much deeper about the things that we do care about and say yes to those things. And I so appreciated also that she described the ways in which her life has been transformed. She's now has a published book, and clearly this has meant a lot in terms of her and her life. But she says, I'm still the same person. I'm still, still messy. It's not perfect. And again, back to what Gina had said earlier about it not being linear, et cetera. It's just a beautiful piece of just someone celebrating a milestone in their life, and yet also recognizing there's still a lot of work for us to do. It's just I love how she's just brought people together in community in some really powerful ways. And also, speaking of women's health, I should mention that a lot, you'll hear this in many of her videos, but talking about women going through menopause, and that's often a lonely experience for women, and maybe they haven't gotten their needs met through their doctors or other medical professionals, or they're just feeling lonely, and that's not It's often something that's taboo to talk about. And she really made that where we could bring some humor to it, but also some awareness. So that's what she's known for. And I think this video is worth a watch, whether you're familiar with the We Do Not Care Club or not. It's a really good watch. Yep. All right, Gina, I get to pass it over to you for whatever you'd like to share.
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna check out the video. I know the movement you're talking about. I know the woman, but I haven't seen the video. Yeah, I mean, when I think about recommendations, some of the things I've talked about today, I'll go ahead and recommend. I was talking about like abolitionist thinking, and I was talking about organizational change. The book that I use as the theoretical foundation for my book, The HSI Movement, is actually Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy. And I love Adrienne Marie Brown, all things Adrienne Marie Brown. So I definitely recommend for sure if you have not checked out some of her work. She's just a good thinker, and she's not an academic, like a traditional academic. So like I said, as those of us in education, we're often bringing stuff from outside, from all kind of different disciplines, and also things that are outside of academia. And Adrienne Marie Brown's work is exactly that. So Emergent Strategy for sure, I recommend. I was trying to do, so I don't read books as often anymore for beyond like for reading for, work rise, but I try to listen to them, right? Like I've been doing a lot more audiobooks. So I'm trying to do 10 audiobooks this summer. And I did do her Holding Change book. I've done 3. I've got to move on to book 4 now. So the 3 books were We Do This Until We Free Us. That's the abolitionist work. And Holding Change, Adrienne Marie Brown's Holding Change, is about facilitation for movement change work. And then just finished Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. So yeah, audiobooks. Lots of the great thinkers are on audiobooks. You can find them. So if you're an audiobook person like I am these days, then yeah, those would be some recommendations I would make.
And I'm curious on the audiobooks, is there anything unique to that format that allows it to be maybe a different experience? For example, do any of these authors read the books themselves? Are they narrators or anything like that?
Yes, Angela Davis does read Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and Adrienne Marie Brown does read her Holding Change. That's a good question, because I actually, the narrator matters a lot. As someone who's newer to audiobooks, because I got into audiobooks after I got into podcasting, and I'm not a good audio learner in general, which is ironic because I have a podcast as well. I had to sort of teach myself how to listen audioly. And I think part of it is because when you say what's unique about them, I can listen to a book while I'm doing something else. But I have to do something else that's not requiring my brain. Like I have to be driving, right? Like, I mean, that requires my brain, but not really. Like I'm not thinking, I'm not actively thinking, I'm just driving. And so I listen in those moments, right? Where I can listen, but also be doing something else that taking up a lot less brain space. But I do enjoy when it's the author that's reading them. The reader, it matters a lot, I think. So yeah, that's a good question.
I think it does too. And I have to tell you, listeners will crack up because this recommendation is just for Gina. The rest of you can turn off. I'm kidding a little bit, but I already recommended this, but it's also a number of other people have too. The audio book of The Correspondent. I don't know if you've heard about that book yet, but it's all about letter writing. It centers on a woman's life. And so she writes letters to people and then they write her back. And it's all different narrators. And for me, I thought I heard about the book but as a book, not as an audio book. And I was like, I don't do good when there's that many dates. And are we going back in time and forward? I don't. So I can't always pay that kind of attention. I'll get distracted in my reading or tired or whatever. So I didn't listen. And then I finally listened. I am also still somewhat new to audiobooks. Boy, the different narrators for the different characters or the different letter writers in this case, makes all the difference. It was so good. That's just for you, Gina. That's a little bonus
okay,
tip for
I'm
you.
going to put it on my list.
Yay.
Of my one of 10 books to listen to.
That's very good. All right. Well, thank you so much. As I mentioned up top, what a pleasure it is to have seen you speak many times and now get to read more of your work than I had in prior years. And just a joy to be connected with you. Thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited.
Thanks once again to Dr. Gina Ann Garcia for being a guest on today's episode. Today's episode was produced by me, Bonnie Stahoviak. It was edited by the ever-talented Andrew Kroger. I would love to invite you to join the Field Guide. That's the email that gets sent out each week with what I've wondered, what I've listened to, what I've read, what I've noted, and I invite you to write back and answer a little bit about what I've been wondering, head over to teachinginhighered.com/subscribe to start receiving the Field Journal each week. And thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.